Hello and welcome to FreeForm Pro. In this tutorial, we'll get a feel for the software and how we can apply it within After Effects. We'll run through most of the settings available and form a basic grounding in its capabilities. From this tutorial, you should take away enough knowledge of FreeForm Pro to start producing some wonderful results right here in After Effects. First of all, let's discuss how FreeForm Pro works. It creates a 3D mesh, which you can then displace in true 3D space. Displacement is calculated using luminance values. So if we use a grayscale, for example, and we want full displacement set to 10, black is not displaced at all, 0. White is fully displaced, 10. One important setting before we do anything is to check that our project file is set to 16-bit color depth. This provides more luminous values, which allows for smoother gradients, which in turn allows for a smoother mesh. So, if we go to File, Project Settings, and make sure our depth is 16 bits per channel, and click OK. So, we're ready to start. Let's create a new composition. Import some assets. Take the texture JPEG and drag it into the timeline. This is now a 2D layer. If we are working in 3D, we need lights and a camera. So the first thing I do is set up an ambient light at 30%. And a point light at 100%. I then add a camera. This is my standard 3D setup. Now whilst I have the 3D setup here, I still can't manipulate this yet because it's still a 2D layer. If we apply the FreeForm Pro plugin to the texture layer, then we see a yellow grid appear. This yellow grid is 2 rows and 2 columns by default. If we twirl the grid down, we can alter this to whatever we want, up to 20, I believe. And now because we've applied the plugin, if we choose our camera, we can rotate in 3D space. So we have created a 3D mesh from this texture, 5 rows and 5 columns. To manipulate the mesh is as easy as dragging the points. Rotating the camera, we'll see we're actually dragging those points in 3D space. These points are all located under the grid control points. There's our rows, and there's row 1, point 1, position X, Y, and Z. These can be manipulated and keyframed as you wish. So let's have a look at a quick example of how to animate those grid points. We can see here's our grid on this particular image, and on row 0, which is the top row, we have attributes for each point, which is the X, Y, and Z axis, and we can animate either one of these. I've applied a simple Dan Ebbert's expression, which is a wiggle with a frequency and amplitude slider up here, which we can animate. So I've applied this to each Z axis position of each point on the grid. As you can see, the result is an undulating effect. We can dial this up and make it a bit more visible. And we get a much more interesting result. we can even go further. If we rotate the camera and turn on the transparency grid, you can see how the mesh is deforming in 3D space. It gives some really interesting results. And if you take this all the way back down to, I don't know, we'll say 50, you get a much more organic blowing in the wind type effect. So this can be useful for cloth paper, or so on and so forth. Another interesting use for the grid control points being animated could be something like a tree. What we've done here is create a mesh with a very rough alpha. You can spend a lot more time actually stylizing this tree, or spending a bit more time with a better alpha map and making it look a lot cleaner. This is just very quick and dirty to illustrate a point. So we've created a mesh and we've animated most of the points on that mesh using the expression as shown previously. We have not animated the grid points that run down the center, so it almost looks as though the mesh is tethered while it undulates. We've then used the generator, which we'll get into in a little bit further in the tutorial, and we've created instances around the y-axis. We've rotated these instances. I'll just start this playing, and you can see the wiggle expression that we've applied to our first instance, the mesh we originally created, has been replicated throughout all of the instances. So we get this undulating tree effect. And if we start randomizing those instances, again, this is all in the generator and it'll make sense a bit later on. If we start randomizing those instances just slightly, then we get a much more organic movement and less symmetrical. As I said before, this is very quick and dirty, but you can see the potential here if you just spend a little bit more time and a simple expression applied to all of the grid control points. Another way to animate the grid points of the mesh could be through sound. So if you had a plugin such as Sound Keys, which took an audio file and converted it to keyframes, you could use the values in these keyframes to drive the grid points of the mesh, like so. So you can see this gives opens up a lot of possibilities to produce some really interesting effects and a great synergy between the audio and the visual. Let's also touch on the auto tangents, which are up just after the grid controls. And if we enable the auto tangents, what we can do then is animate the tangents based upon a row and column bias. So I'll just knock the resolution down to a quarter, and if you play, you can see you can get some very interesting effects. And this is just a simple graphic. Let's have a look at the mesh. Zoom out. Yeah. This is just a simple mesh with the center point pulled backwards. Push it back, as you can see. And then some animation random animation has been applied to the midpoints here, and as a result you get this nice organic animated tangent. This is great for abstract visuals, I find, and also for things like grass and fields and organic displacement. Very interesting to play with, and I do suggest that you have a play around with this, because some of the results can be very surprising, very unexpected, and just a delight to play with. So back to our practice layer, and let's keep moving down the settings, we have the material properties. So when you change your 2D layer into a 3D mesh, it inherits properties. The material properties is how light transmission and the mesh react together. For instance, the ambient light has 100% effect at the minute. If I turn it down, my ambient light is having no effect. The same with the diffuse, which would be a point or your spotlight. Take it down and it's only lit by the ambient now. Specular, shininess, etc. You play with these, get the look of the material that you want. And opacity we'll get into a little bit later on. At the moment, it just takes down the opacity of the entire mesh. Reflectivity we'll also cover a little bit later on, as with Fresnel, just because they require a bit more of an in-depth explanation and they are useful for other things. So let's have a look at the backside controls. Now, what's this? If we spin around the back of our mesh, we'll see the texture on the back of the mesh is the same as the front. If we wanted to add a different texture or color to the back of that mesh, then that is possible. If we add a new layer, new solid, we'll make it red, drop it down the back, and we'll turn it off. Now, if we go back into FreeForm Pro and we choose that layer for our backside layer, you can see it's now been applied and we still have the texture layer on the front. In the next section, we'll be discussing displacement mapping. This is where FreeForm Pro gets really exciting. Before we move into the displacement mapping side of FreeForm Pro, I'm just going to reset the camera from our earlier part of the tutorial, and I'm also going to reset FreeForm Pro. Now the first thing we need to do is create a displacement layer. So I'm going to create a new composition, call it Displace, click OK, and in this composition I'm going to add a new solid. I'll apply the circle effect, and there we have what could be a displacement layer. We have a white value which is fully displaced. So if we go back into the main layer, main composition, I'm going to lock this composition. I'm going to drag in the displace and turn it off visibility wise, and then I'm going to open the displace and drag it to the right window. This little setup means that we can displace in the right window and see the results immediately in the left window as they apply to the mesh. So let's go into FreeForm Pro settings and let's choose our displace. At the moment there's no displacement height, so let's push that up, take the camera and just turn around, and you can see we now have displacement of this mesh based upon these values here. So I'm just going to quickly go into the light options and turn the shadows on so you can see better what's happening. As you notice, the displacement edge is very jagged. We can change this. If we open the tessellation and we change the subdivisions, which is basically the resolution for this displacement mesh, we push them right up, you can see it smooth out quite nice. You can also go in the displacement layer and apply a fast blur. The fast blur changes the transition from being really sharp from white to black and smooths it out, and you can see it smoothing immediately in the left hand side. If you smooth it out further, create a different displacement. So what we see is a flat area here which is not displaced, and a grey area and the white area which is fully displaced. But if we look at our displacement composition and we turn on the transparency grid, you can see there are no values here. There are no luminance values. So by default, we'll just get a flat value here in FreeForm Pro. If we just want to see our mesh, our displacement layer, our displacement area, what we need to do is enable polygonal alpha clip. And once you click that, you'll see it's clipped away all the values which don't have any luminance. It's also clipped away 50% of our displacement mesh. To pull this level back down, simply open up the contour and take the alpha level down. And there we have our full displacement. So let's have a look. We have no values here, so there is no value here. And from this area, smoothed into the fully white area, we have a circle. This is reflected on the left hand side. If, however, you wanted to create the effect of, say, something coming through a wall or pushing through a sheet, then it would be a good idea to have luminance values here, even if they were just flat, without this cookie cutter type effect of the mesh. To do that, simply create a black solid and drag it under the circle, and there we have a white circle smoothing to a black background reflected in the displacement here. So let's try something a bit different. I'm going to go into our displace composition. I'm going to delete what we have in there currently. I'm going to go into our project and I'm going to pull in a depth map I've already created in Cinema 4D, which provides some nice luminance values here, and you can see how it displaces the mesh over here. So unlike the circle, these values here are actually black. So you will have this flat area on the mesh itself unless you wish to clip these values. So to do that, we can apply a luma key, and let's turn the transparency grid, and we can simply bump that up to key out the black areas, and you'll see that gives us just the face, just the mask itself, nicely clipped. So let's keep moving down the displacement map settings, and the next setting is displacement map channels. We'll cover this a bit more in depth later, as it's very advanced and one of the new features of FreeForm Pro and very powerful. A bit more simplistic is the displacement noise, which is also new. So what we can do is, to this mesh we can apply an amplitude of, say, 50, and you can see the mesh is deformed based upon a standard noise pattern. It's quite smooth at the moment. You could change the sources, make more sources, you get a more crumpled mesh, and you could change the frequency to deform the mesh even further. These can of course all be animated. Let's have a look at some displacement noise in action. Here we're simulating a waterscape, and it consists of one solid with displacement noise added. Have a look at the settings. So you can see the displacement noise settings here. These are animated, the evolution and direction is animated over time, so it has a lovely organic flow to it, so it actually looks like water. It's rotated on, let's open the 3D transform, it's rotated on the X-axis, pulled down in 3D space. There's a sky which has been turned into a 3D layer and pushed all the way back, and we're using an extra displacement map for these towers, which actually are part of this mesh. Now the reason I wanted to make these part of this particular mesh is because this light, I wanted it to cast a shadow across the mesh here. So if it's part of the same mesh, then you'll get these lovely shadows which react to the noise itself as it moves. So if we take a look at this displacement layer quickly, you'll see it's based around the luminance values on the red channel. So the red channel luminance value here is fully displaced. However, this area here is still black, not displaced at all. So if we go back into the freeform settings, what you can see is the displacement map channels, which we will cover a little bit later in the tutorial. The only one I'm using for displacement noise is everywhere that is not red. So that whole black area of the displacement layer has been used for the displacement noise. So that's why the displacement noise is only affecting the black areas of the solid, and the red circles are fully displaced because we're displacing on the layer's red channel. This will become more clear as we move on and we go through the displacement map channels themselves. But for the moment, it gives a good indication of what you can actually achieve through displacement noise. Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to close this layer so we can see this one a little bit better, and take off the amplitude on the displacement noise. Moving down, we've already described what happens with the alpha level in the contour. You can see the eyes extruding all the way to the base of the mesh here. I'm just going to move the alpha level up and clip them, which gives me more of a mask effect. So that's fine. The reflection mapping, which is one of my particular favorites. The reflection layer is currently set to none. However, these settings are tied in heavily with the material properties and the reflectivity settings, which is at the moment 100%. So let's go to the project and drag in our reflection layer, turn it off, and in FreeForm Pro I'm going to set that layer as the reflection layer, and you see a nice reflection immediately on the face. And because the material properties are set to 100% reflectivity, you see full reflection. Now you can take this down and you can have a slightly reflective surface, which looks quite nice. You can also change the material properties as well. It's basically all depending on what look you want to achieve. So for this purpose, I'm going to put it 100% reflectivity. Go back down. You have different UV maps. So we have a spherical map at the moment. You have cubic, and you have equirectangular available to you. You can of course change the blending mode of the reflection mapping too. Let's keep running down the settings. Render quality. Render mode is currently set to full render. You can change this to wireframe, so you can see how the mesh is built up. You can change it to depth, creates a depth map, which you could use in conjunction with a camera lens blur. Anti-aliasing is currently set on medium. Just before I render out, I usually set to very high for best results. 3D transparency will be discussed in the shapeshifter tutorial in depth. Tessellation is the resolution of the mesh itself. At the moment it's set to 742 subdivisions. You can bump this up to 1000 or down as low as you require depending on the look of the mesh. The generator itself is a whole new world within FreeForm Pro. All of the settings are keyframeable. At the moment we have one instance of this mesh. What if we wanted 8? And let's have a look. And here we see we have 8 instances now of this mesh. Let me just quickly dial these down to the default settings. So this is what you'll see. And the instances are all offset on the Z-axis by 500. You can change that to whatever you prefer. You can have spiral rotations based around the center point, or you can have incremental rotations and create some really interesting and wonderful visuals. You can also change the scale, the incremental scale, and you can add random factors. We will cover the generator a little bit more in the shapeshifter tutorial, so I won't touch on it too much here. We're going to go back to displacement mapping now and learn about the displacement map channels. Let's change the instances back to 1. And we have one mesh now. Open up the displacement mapping and the displacement map channels. What this allows us to do, it allows us to isolate parts of a mesh for different effects. So we could have one part which was displacement noise, and one part of the mesh could be reflective. How do we do this? Well, we separate things out using the red, green, and blue channels. So let's have a look at our displacement map. So before we do this, let's lock that composition in place, open up our displacement map, drag that composition over to the right so we can see what's happening on the left here. And here we are in the displacement map itself, displacement composition, sorry. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the face to the red channel, and we're going to isolate the background as a blue channel. Now at the moment I have the Luma key on, so you can see that there is no luminance value here and it's transparent. I'm going to turn that Luma key off and we can see the background reappear here, which is what we want. So first of all, I'm going to change the face to the red channel. I'm going to create a new solid, fully red, and turn it off so I can draw a mask upon it. This mask is rough and ready, and it's just going to mask out the basic face shape. I'll turn this back on, and at the moment we only have one luminosity value. We want a range to displace this mesh. So if I change the blending mode to multiply, we get a displacement. Now you'll notice it's not a displacement that was as good as the previous mesh. Why? Well, it's because we're displacing on the RGB Luma channels at the moment, and what we really want to displace on is the red channel. So we're displacing our mesh now based upon the red channel we've just created in the displace layer. So that's fine. Now we want to isolate the background. So let's create a new solid. And we're going to do this on the blue channel. So let's make it fully blue. I'm going to turn it off and take the mask from the red channel and copy it, Control C, and paste it onto the blue solid, Control V or Command V on the Mac. Okay, so it's the same mask at the moment, but I'm going to invert the one I've just pasted, and there we have it. So what we have now is we have our displacement map, which is displacing just as it was before. We have our red values and our blue values. Now let's see what we can do with these. So if I go to use for reflection, for instance, I only want to reflect on the face and not the background. So the background being blue, if I choose everything that's not blue, i.e. the red channel for the face, then the reflection is only shown on the face. And for the displacement noise, let's say I pump this up to 50. Yeah. And if I only want to displace on the blue channel, then I simply choose blue, and we only see the displacement where the blue channel is. Again, if we have a look at the displacement layer, composition, you can see here we have the red channel, here we have the blue channel. And that is how you use the displacement map channels. Very powerful. And once you get used to it, very easy to use. Now we're going to have a look at the Environment tab. I've created a very simplistic landscape here. I'll just quickly run through how I did this. It's a texture layer with a soil texture, a displace layer, which is a standard displacement map, a height map if you like, a sky which has been made into a 3D layer and pushed back in space. I then applied FreeForm Pro to the texture layer and displaced using the displace layer by 180. After it's been displaced, it's been rotated on the X axis, and then using the generator I've created 10 instances of that particular landscape. I've offset them on Y so we have more distance to play with, and I've added slight rotations to get this random environment. That's basically it. So let's have a look at the environment, and we have mist and fog. Now whilst they do different things, they are very similar in the settings, so we're just going to concentrate on the fog. At the moment this looks very separate, this landscape from the sky, and quite flat. Let's give it some depth. So if we apply a linear fog type, you can just in the background there see this black area. Let me turn it off again and turn it back on. Black area turned to a lighter color. Now the fog color by default will be black. So if we change it to whatever the sky color is on that horizon, we should get a better idea of how it's going to work. So the fog near will have it starting about 2000 instead of 6000, and you can already see the change that that is making to the landscape itself. Let's change that to 500 just for effect. And we have a very large fall off. If we want to pull that far level back a bit and make it a bit more dense, then we change it to 1000, and you can see now how it's actually worked. Now we've bumped it right up here just for illustrative purposes. So if we want to be more realistic, I don't know, maybe 8000 would be a better idea, and that would give us some nice depth to our landscape. And you can see it brings the sky into play because the color is actually sampled from the sky, and it gives it a nice atmosphere, a very, very good and realistic atmosphere. So that is how we use the environment, and the mist is used similar. So we've had a quick and basic run through the settings of FreeForm Pro. The ones that were omitted slightly are the ones that will be described in more detail in the Shapeshifter tutorial. So I hope to see you there. My name's Lavelle. Thank you very much.